Hi, and welcome to this episode of Off the Charts. I'm Mark Simon, your resident question asker, joined by Matt Manocherian, the Vice President of Football and R&D for Sports Info Solutions. We've been so focused on talking about the future here with all of our NFL draft talk. We figured it was time to shift the focus slightly, stick to future talk, and touch on the future of football data. And we start with our first guest. Michael Lopez is the Director of Football Data and Analytics for the NFL. His work centers on how to use data to better understand football. It's pretty simple. Michael, thank you for joining us. Explain your role in more comprehensive terms for those unfamiliar.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to talk football data and the future of football data. I work at the NFL League office, and broadly, our job is to use data to better understand the game. And you know, it's sort of an easy description, but we look at basically everything that happens on the field. We're trying to understand it and make sure the rules are in place to keep the game in as good a position as possible. So that's things like competitiveness, health and safety, officiating, pace of play, things like that.
I think a number of our listeners are fairly advanced and are probably familiar with your work. Can you just give us an example of something like, say, what did you do this week?
Well, it's off season. So off season means, building new models and new frameworks for analysis that we'll use next year. We're trying to, from our perspective, dive deeper into some of the player tracking data this offseason. And typically we've used it to look at players and model, player movements on the field and things like that. This year, we're trying to think about penalties and specifically how we can use player tracking to better understand penalties. So that could be, when in the next gen stats did an offensive holding occur, but that's not something that's currently tagged. For example, it could be where certain penalties are more likely to occur than less likely to occur. And we can use that to help inform our officiating group with respect to, where their eyes should be and where players are more likely to commit fouls.
That's awesome. I know that the NBA has done some work that's similar. They really improved their officiating over the last 10 years or so, mostly just based on placing the officials better by using the tracking data to make sure they were in better position. Is that something similar that you found on the NFL side? Is actually where the officials are positioned has an impact on their ability to make calls?
Well, a lot of what goes into a call in football is where where and what you can see with respect to the players and the positioning. And so, for example, you could have a close defensive pass interference call right in front of you, but if what you see is the front of the wide receiver and you can't see the defensive back at all, it might actually be an easier angle for somebody coming from the middle of the field. And so trying to understand what goes into some of those calls it's not just a matter of can you get as close to the call as possible? It's, is it better to be stopped and sort of focused on the play, or is it better to be moving in closer? Even something as simple as that is stuff we're trying to tease out.
That's cool. And just going back to the idea of what you do this week, what do you do during a typical week during the season?
We're a lot like the folks that would work on clubs, and in the sense that we typically provide week summaries on Monday and Tuesday, and then turn to sort of like what's coming this upcoming weekend, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then time at the end of the week to tinker and improve. We very much look at what happened every Sunday on Monday morning. We have basically all of our group is no different than a lot of our fans. We're watching the games, trying to understand what are the new things that coaches are looking at, what are the new things that players are doing, what are the new types of play calls, what are the new maybe hot button topics that the media will be talking about, and trying to think about, from our perspective, is there any data that we can look at to think about those questions. That's early in the week, and then typically by Wednesday, Thursday, most of that's been forgotten, and then we're sort of on to what do we expect in these upcoming sets of games. We provide our officiating group with pregame scouting reports, very similar to what an offensive coordinator would get looking at the defense. We want them to be prepared for what they're seeing next week too. So those types of things come later in the week.
It's interesting because you mentioned at one point kind of seeing the game like a fan, not so different than a fan. We all know there are fans that are like, I'm watching my team. There are fans that kind of watch every game, love the league. And now you have like the fantasy gambling type fan. I feel like your job is a little bit analogous to that, in that you're kind of like the same work that a team does, but your focus has to be just so much more broad level. Like when I go to the football operations website and I look at the chart, the data section, I notice that you have things there on the league level showing up. And that's something that I think most people immediately go to, where does my team rank? This is kind of interesting because you're zoomed out, and that probably is really similar to a lot of things about your job.
Right. Like we ultimately, when we look back on the week, it's mostly like aggregated across all these games. And a lot of times when we even talk about some of the players and the teams, it's you sort of lose sight about who those teams are and what the records are. And most of the focus is on, keeping players safe, keeping the games competitive, making sure that the pace of play is sort of fast paced enough that we're we don't have too long of a break in within the games. So those things, by and large, are player agnostic. And so, I typically have red zone on only because it just sort of gives like the broadest sense possible of like what's going on in all the games. But I ultimately don't really care who the players are that are catching the passes. So it's mostly a focus on what the league is doing as a whole, and then extracting some trends from there.
So, Mark, I know you'll appreciate this. He doesn't care about the colors of the laundry. It's just that they're wearing laundry, period, basically.
As someone who worked in sports television and tracked things on a very broad level, I'm familiar with the idea of that. All right. So Next Gen started in 2013, 2014, when the NFL started putting tags in shoulder pads. You came on board after that. Before we look at the future, let's look at the past briefly. Can you give us an overview of Next Gen's evolution in your time with the NFL?
Sure. So 2017 is really the earliest data that after sort of the testing phases that they shared with teams. But even in that first season, you only got it on your own team. And that was kind of awkward because you couldn't really to get a good sense of what's going on across the league. You didn't have a way to standardize it really. For the 2018 season, which coincidentally was my first year at the league office, league officials agreed that we're going to give this to all teams on all games. And so the 2018 season was the first one where you could sort of say like, okay, this is, what other teams are doing and sense of how their players are moving and the space that's available and things like that. So in that time, we basically had now 3+ years really to dive into the data and think deeply about like, what's going on. And from a team perspective too, I mean, I think this is data that they haven't had for ages. A lot of the metrics that they're curating and coming up with, they not only don't share with me, but they're also developing for the first time because, we haven't had this data for a decade or whatever.
So how well do you feel that you're currently able to evaluate a few different things? And let's start with player value from a positional standpoint and in a play-by-play world, like play-to-play. How well do you feel you're able to evaluate player value?
Well, so I think from a broad football perspective, painting the league with a wide brush, I think it's totally player position specific. I think there are positions that are much easier to evaluate than others in football, and that makes it a little bit difficult to try and understand the value of one player versus the other player, because realistically, if I've come up with a lot of metrics for offensive linemen, I probably have a little bit of a different level of confidence than if I come up with this different set of metrics for defensive backs. And particularly because if you're using tracking data for a lot of these metrics, you don't have a long set of, you don't have a lot of years to sort of judge the reliability of some of these metrics. And that can make it hard to sort of understand like, okay, well, I know this offensive lineman rated as this year. Realistically, how reliable is that it's going to come next year at a similar? It's very position specific. And I think some positions the evaluation is further along than others. And the hard part about football is that there are a lot of events that aren't tracked and that they're not tracked at all anywhere. And even watching film, it can be tricky to try and better understand what the coach wanted a player to do versus what the player actually chose to do. Whereas like you look at a kicker, the kicker's tasked with making a field goal. That's probably that kicker's goal on that play. And it's not to say that those other positions can't be done. It's just going to take more time. And from the perspective of using tracking data and integrating outside data like Sports Info Solutions or PFF or other sources, right? Trying to bridge all those together is not something that, we'll look in the year 2030 and look back at whatever we were doing in 2021 and saying like, yeah, I can't really believe we did that. But that's just sort of the evolution of the sports world. And it's an exciting time because, like I tell most folks when they start working in big datable data, by and large, when you're trying to answer a question, you're the first one to ever answer that question. And you might literally be the first one to ever even think of that question. And that's humbling. It's scary. It takes time to get right. But that's the sort of where we are in the evolution of football.
You mentioned 2030. So with that in mind, what is the future of evaluating players on a kind of a play-to-play basis within their position for value?
To be totally honest, if I knew, I'd probably go work for a team. But it's I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of. I think ultimately it's integrating all of your data and trying to make the most out of it. A lot of the NFL scouts do lots of long hours and have incredible domain knowledge about the game of football. And it even is something as simple like, let's get next gen stat and our external data and code it into our language and put it in front of our coaches. So it's not even just it's not even just from a player evaluation standpoint, but it's also like, how can we use it to actually make better decisions in the game? How can we use it to make better decisions in free agency? Because the analysts can do all the work they want, but it has to kind of be a organizational commitment to using a lot of that information.
The other area that I think we particularly like, and Matt can certainly speak to this, is the expected stat family. And I know that both the NFL and our company do a lot with that. Is there anything that you see for the future of expected stats?
More of them, I think, is probably where we're going. I mean, the thing with football, and this is something that you two both know, is that your expectations are conditional on a lot of different things, and that you're basically looking at conditional probability distributions. And so when we did expected yards, we actually didn't just get an expectation on the number of yards. We got probabilities associated with every possible yardage gain. And if we have probabilities associated with every possible yardage gain, there's only a discrete number of yardage that could be gained. We can turn that into expected yards pretty easily. And we can get expected touchdowns. We can get an expected number of first downs, things like that. And the entirety of football, I think, from the start of a play to the end of the play, can be looked at as sort of sets of conditional probabilities. And for example, you just look at the start of the play. What is the probability of a pass versus a run? And then conditional on it being a pass. What is the likelihood that it's being complete versus incomplete versus intercepted? I mean, even versus drawing a defensive pass interference. And you can watch those probabilities change throughout the course of a drop back. That's eventually where we want to get to, but that takes a lot of time. And right now we have, set of numbers that, like our next stats group curious, we have expected completion probability, but there are a lot of those things that can work over the course of a play. And there's been some preliminary work in football in those types of things. But ultimately, I think a lot of where we'll want to get to involves iterating those throughout a play and thinking about, what do those conditional expectations look like?
When you talk about just how humbling it all is and approaching questions for the first time, it's a combination of, this is where we want to get to. I have an idea of where I want to go. Hopefully we have an idea of where we want to go. But if you actually were to say as an analyst, I know where we're going to be 10 years from now, that's basically the main guarantee I can say that you have no idea where you're going. Because with all of these conditional probabilities, like what you're talking about, you can cut it. Will it be complete or incomplete? But what about all those like micro interactions that happen in between, whether it's a run and a pass and whether it's complete and incomplete? And as we are able to measure things, realize that we've been able to measure and actually make them actionable, I feel like there's such a possibility that one thing could have just a cascading effect on the way that we understand almost everything else. Football is so interrelated. I think when you said it's humbling, that's the part of it for me that makes me go back. Like if we can actually get a better sense of offensive line value and really, really answer that question, we might have a totally different opinion on how valuable we think receivers are, for example. And just the interrelatedness that's what I take solace in, though. We can't possibly get everything right now. So let's just try to keep getting better.
Right. There was a really good example of what you were talking about, Matt, at this year's Big Data Bowl that I think made us think a little bit about some of the things that we're using in our models and even from a perspective of, some of it came up with how we judge the competitor this year's Big Data Bowl too. But one of the questions was if you're going to generate a target probability model. So you're thinking about just even at a bet model base, the quarterback has to pass, and the characteristics of the wide receivers and the defensive backs at the time of the throw. And so you're looking at, let's say there are 4 or 5 wide receivers. Each one has a probability of being thrown to, given that the quarterback is currently throwing a pass. One of the questions is, do you include quarterback orientation? And so in other words, if I include that a quarterback is facing a wide receiver, that quarterback is much more likely to be throwing to that wide receiver, right? And if the quarterback is facing right, he's probably not throwing a pass directly behind him to his left. But then the question is, like, if I'm using it to evaluate defensive backs, then maybe the reason that the quarterback is facing away from the left and facing to his right is because Darrelle Revis is out on the left, right? This is, a couple of years ago or whatever. So or Stephon Gilmore, right? And so, if I'm using it, I might have different models based on how I'm trying to use it. If I want to understand which quarterbacks are not throwing to certain or which defensive backs are preventing targets, that's maybe I have to sort of think about like what is the value of including variables in the model, because my sort of outcomes in terms of targets over expected or things like that, which defensive backs come up on top is going to be partially based on which variables I include. And so even something as simple as like it's this model, but which variables you're including are not obvious questions to answer, even if, or at least from the sense of you're not always trying to just maximize how predictive your model is. You're also trying to use it to think about player evaluation, and the variables you include will make a big difference that way.
You're making me think of a story. When I was working in New Orleans, as my first year in 2009, I went to the receivers coach and I said, "Who's the best route runner on the team?" And I thought I knew the answer. It was Lance Moore. But he came and he said, "Well, what kind of route do you want? Do you want somebody that can post up like Marcus Colston? Do you want guys that can take the top off the defense like Robert Meacham? Do you want somebody that can get in and out like that?" And he said, at the end of the day, I probably value what Meacham does as a route runner more than these other guys who I thought in my head were better, quote unquote, route runners, because Meacham takes the top off the defense. And every football person understands the value of taking the top off the defense and what that stress does to your defense, just having to expand the field that you cover. And if you're trying to understand how Travis Kelce performs, understanding that Tyreek Hill is having a big impact on that a lot of the time by just what he's doing and what he's making the defense account for, that's probably not going to show up in very many models that people are doing these days. That I think it's another example of the point that you're making. And also the point you made earlier about how we have to make things connect back in a football sense that actually captures what we're trying to capture.
Love that analogy.
So I know that it's easy, especially in your position, to say, I like them all. But of the stat offerings that are out there now that your group provides, which do you like the most?
The expected yards one was interesting because I tried and failed. We worked with other folks, other data scientists who tried, and not that there was failure, but there definitely wasn't you couldn't match the play where you knew that the running back was picking up 7 or 8 yards and the prediction said 4.8. And it just didn't make sense, right? That you would have all world NFL running backs getting the ball with a ton of space and your prediction says 5 and you knew they would get 8 or 10 or whatever. And by the same question, you could have situations where the running back got stuffed and there was just no room anywhere. And your model was saying 2.2, right? That wasn't something we were going to put on the air. And for us to, and obviously we didn't do any of the work. We shared the data. We came up with a question and we helped generate the metric, which I think helped, right? We got a distribution of all possible yards and we came look for, expected yards, but also expected touchdowns, expected first downs, things like that. Dimitri and Philip, who are 2 data scientists from Austria, they are experts at Kaggle and machine learning, and they use a technique similar to, I think, how they won like a chemistry competition to look at sort of the location of a player relative to other players and the speed relative to other players. And it was sort of a different layer of thinking that we weren't really ready for. And that's not something that any other Kaggle competitors have thought of even either. But the really nice thing for us was, that it was one thing just to sort of come up with a metric, but it was also another to sort of see like, okay, can we get this integrated so that when a play happens in a game, we can get that number right away, because there's a different level of value from like an analysis perspective. Our teams want it after the game, but if we're going to use it on the media side, we can't wait 3 hours to go through a prediction algorithm or whatever. We need that instantaneously. It started creeping into the conversation this past early in the sense that like we saw it like maybe at halftime or at the end of game on the network. In the NFC title game, there was a scenario where I think they showed they showed it, I want to say like in quarter 1 or quarter 2, with Leonard Fournette's run. And it was just kind of exciting to see like, okay, here's the run, go to commercial break, you cut back and it's like, here's Leonard Fournette's expectation. Here's the yardage over expectation. I'm partial to that just because like that, just the amount of work involved to get to that point. And ultimately I did the easier part, right? I actually failed at building the model. And so I turned it over to smarter people who could. I think that was kind of rewarding to see it come to fruition.
Maybe that was the easy part, but maybe that was the kind of true genius. I mean, we've seen what the public has been able to accomplish in baseball analytics for years. It's probably not surprising, but kudos to you for thinking outside the box in terms of how to get that done. And I'm with you. I was super excited to see the yards over expectation during the playoffs being used on the air. I think, one of the most useful football statistics that's probably ever been invented. Like, for all the talk about running backs, now we can actually understand a little bit better what the value really is. So I thought it was awesome in that respect.
Thanks. I think for us, it's not only the yards over expectation, it's also the expectation to begin with, from the sense of like which running backs or which ball carriers get easier opportunities. I think like when we go back and even somebody, I think it was like late season this year, I did like teams that have had the highest number of expected big plays, which was just like find the number of times they've had an expected run with 10 or more yards. And at that point, I think it was the Patriots who were first, which makes no sense because it's not like you would think they would have a dominant running game. But McDaniels calls enough sort of cute end arounds where, it doesn't matter who the ball carrier is, they got a ton of open space. And, those that add some credibility to sort of, the expectation in terms of, you create some of those opportunities for your players, and you're going to, have a potentially better offense that is going to sneak up. And obviously I wouldn't call this a banner year for the Patriots offense, but the fact that they were still able to pull those off is a good sign for, I guess, the creativity of it.
You mentioned those end arounds that are potential big gains in terms of the expected yards. Do you also see that those are kind of also big bust plays? Like for every 10-yard expected gain, do you also see a -5 that comes up on those plays? Or would you probably, based on the data, recommend that teams go back to the well a little bit more with that sort of a play design?
That's a good question. I think it's probably a larger question about the value of trick plays in general, which is that part of some of those being successful is that the handoff had to go through to begin with. Same thing with like a double pass, right? You can call a double pass, but if the first pass is dropped, it doesn't go into the play-by-play as a double pass, it just goes in as an incomplete pass, or arguably actually it goes in as a fumble, right? And so sometimes you can look at those and be like, oh yeah, we got to call more of these because the expectation is so high. But if there were 3 or 4 other times where the quarterback, took a big hit and didn't even get the ball off, that's not going in as a trick hand around. That's going in as a tackled quarterback. And that's where the value of having like, what was the original play call would make a little bit of difference. Because if you can go back and try and find like all the times where the trick play was actually called, that might give you a different perspective than if you're just looking at the play-by-play data to identify if it was a trick play.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's amazing how no matter like what aspect of football we look at, like I said, the yards over expectations is cool. You said the expected yards is what's really cool about that. And it's just amazing how football, no matter what angle we look at it, it's such a game of opportunity. The stability is always in the opportunity. It's almost never in the performance above or below average. We're working on something right now where we find the same thing. We're calling it pressures above expectation, looking at front 7 players and how well they affect the quarterback, with the thought basically being, we know that pressures are more predictive than sacks. Let's try to create something that's more predictive than pressures. And what we're finding right away is that the expected pressure rate, based on all the things that we kind of know about before the play even starts, is what's really dictating who's going to make the pressure. Yeah, you see Aaron Donald performs on the top of the leaderboard, but even knowing how good he is, you can tell much more about how many pressures he's going to get based on his usage than you can by understanding a lot of information about the player himself. It just seems like we see that over and over again, that same story. We called it the ultimate team sport when I was growing up. Maybe it's just the ultimate interdependent sport, the ultimate sport of opportunity.
And I think one of the things we don't have a great sense on now is the value of coaching and the value of from an offensive perspective, creating that space for your wide receivers, from the defensive perspective, creating those lanes for your rushers, right, to create the pressures or whatever. And it's a sort of the same aspect. How much value is it in having a great quarterback versus a great offense coordinator is something that we're far away from answering.
I spent 4 years with Sean Payton and Drew Brees. I can tell you the combination of them was the reason why we won a lot of games. I can't tell you which one was responsible for how much. And I can't wait until we get to the point where we can answer that sort of question.
Michael, is there something, I know that on the baseball side, sprint speed has caught on big time, and 90-foot splits has not. People just don't seem into that. Is there something on the NFL side that hasn't caught on like you thought it would? Or there's like a hidden gem that you think is sitting out there for people to latch onto?
I don't know if I have any corollaries that would match those in baseball. Nothing really stands out that hasn't caught on. I would say the I think in a public perspective, folks that are really comfortable now with win probability and expected points, and those two have caught on more so than certainly more so than maybe 5 years ago. And I think they're now part of the lexicon. There's a lot of commentators that are very comfortable using expected points and win probability to better understand what happens. And a lot of the public work that's been done in football, I think, is sort of really helped push those narratives along. And that's not something the league has done, but it has, I think, made the football world a little bit more comfortable in talking about advanced metrics. Is that, by and large, people might use passer rating to evaluate quarterbacks, but nobody is really using it, right? So like the difference is the sort of the football lingo, I think, has really picked up in the last couple of years. And I don't know if I would call that a surprise, but certainly if you look at how often teams are passing, how often they're going forward on fourth down, and the commonplace of hearing things like EPA and WPA and public conversations about football. Maybe there's some selection bias in terms of who I'm listening to talk about football, but it does seem, I think that's kind of probably the biggest surprise in football is that it hasn't taken a ton of time relative to where the sport was 4 or 5 years ago.
So last night I was looking at something that was a little old. I was looking at some of your syllabuses for some of your classes that are online from when you're teaching at Skidmore. You taught data viz and storytelling there, and I certainly would have liked to have taken that class. How much time goes into that aspect of it? You mentioned commentators. You mentioned Fox showing something. I think it takes a long time to get Joe Buck, Al Michaels, Mike Tirico, whoever you're going to get on board. I'm curious, what goes into that?
Trial and error, I think, is probably our groups. A lot of the things we'll do will come from one of our analysts or myself, and it's like, hey, how does this look? And then it's, maybe there's 8 or 10 different charts all showing the same thing that are meant for our group only, right? Just like which one shows it best, like what are the best ways to put this in front of decision makers. The group that we work with in terms of probably the most pressure is the competition committee. We supplement all of the rule change conversations with data and charts. And ultimately we have, we certainly are far from getting a vote, but we're supplying data that helps them decide if they're voting, to support a rule change or against a rule change. And so we have to think about what are the best ways to share some of our models and some of our findings. And we don't get a lot of opportunities. It's sort of like the draft. You don't get like a bunch of drafts to try over to pick players. You get one, and we're the same way in our off season. It's like we get one opportunity to sort of put stuff in front of them, and maybe it goes well, maybe it doesn't, but they pick up on things really easily. And I remember there was one graph I shared a couple of years ago with sort of like penalties that impact the game. And Coach Tomlin on the Steelers, I had 2 graphs up and they had a different y-axis, and he pointed it out. He was like, why is your second y-axis different than your first? And I was like, I can go back to that Divi's syllabus that Mark just referenced and said, here's by and large why you should, think about your y-axis carefully and probably why you would want to keep the same scale. And it was one of those like defaults in ggplot that like nobody in our group had caught, and Coach Tomlin had. And I was like, Coach, you're right. I'll get you a different version afterwards and you can see and compare. I don't think it'll change the findings ultimately, but that's a good point.
Mike Tomlin, the data viz expert.
Yeah. Well, it sure says like they're paying attention. I think that and they always are, but like that level of detail, right? To sort of see like, okay, like they're focused on this and that, and they're seeing things that your group didn't see. Was sort of something that is good, valuable input. So that's kind of our focus, is thinking about those choices and in terms of the best things to put in front of them.
Seeing things that you didn't see. I think that's a good way to sum up next gen as a whole, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Michael Lopez, in 30 seconds, any final thought as we wrap things up here?
No, it's a great time to be in football data, and appreciate you having me on. I would note, our group has run the Big Data Bowl for 3 straight years now. Our first year was mostly focused on pass routes and combination patterns. Second year was expected rush yards. This past year we did the secondary. And I don't know what next year is going to be, but we plan to launch in August and September. And so I encourage folks to participate. And it's a great way to get a job in football or a job in all sports and sort of get your hands messy.
All right. Michael Lopez, thank you very much.
The Sports Info Solutions Injury Risk Model and Application is sweeping the NFL, providing never-before-seen insights to the most cutting-edge teams in the league. If you work for an NFL team as a scout, analyst, coach, trainer, or executive, and you don't have access to the SIS Injury Risk Model and Application, you're missing out on game-changing information that has endless use cases. Our model is tested and calibrated so you can take the guesswork out of injury risk projections and reliably quantify the impact of injury risk on any decisions that you make. This product is exclusively available to NFL teams, and it comes with access through both a data feed and an online interface. The model updates on a nightly basis throughout the season to take into account the constantly updating stream of information. If you work for an NFL team and are interested in learning more about the SIS Injury Risk Model and Application, please reach out to us at offthecharts@sportsinfosolutions.com.
All right, up next, we've got Alex Vigderman from the SIS Research Team on. We are going to kind of react to some of that Michael Lopez interview. Wanted to see, Alex, what from your perspective stood out to you? What jumped out about that conversation? Let's start off at the beginning. What's the first thing that you wanted to talk about?
It really was kind of at the beginning. It was kind of a throwaway line from him, but he mentioned that their group looks at the types of play calls and if there's new types of plays being called by offenses, which isn't the kind of thing that you'd expect that they would care about. But you kind of think about it, and yeah, if teams are using really weird alignments, or they're putting players in different positions than they would normally, or they're running route combinations that are potentially disruptive to where referees normally stand. These are the sort of things that they want to prep referees for and make sure that they're not putting themselves in a bad position. They're not making calls they shouldn't make because they're uncomfortable. It's just a layer of preparing referees that you don't really think about in terms of the kind of stuff that they would normally be looking at.
Yeah, I'm with you. I didn't even remember that he said that when you first mentioned that. But I am fascinated by that. And it just, for me, it goes back to just the whole perspective of working from the league office. We obviously look at the whole league, but we're much more like a team in the way that we look at things. We are looking at it from the vantage point, not just of one team, from really 32 teams, but he's really looking at it from a totally different view. And just the sort of questions that he must ask himself on a day-to-day basis are just so different than probably the way that all of the teams plus any company like us and really most anybody else that's really analyzing the sport. It's just a different perspective.
Yeah. And obviously we see some of the work that he and his group put out, the big data ball, all that kind of stuff. And that makes you feel as a fan like you're thinking about the same kinds of things. And then you realize like, oh, actually, as part of his day-to-day job, week-to-week job, it's a whole different range of questions that they're worrying about.
What else jumped out to you about the interview?
Yeah. The other thing I thought was really interesting was the sort of chicken and egg problem with quarterbacks and defensive backs. So the idea that if quarterback's facing his right side, do I give the defensive back more credit because potentially he's deterring the quarterback from even looking that direction? Do I give the defensive back less credit because the quarterback's not even looking his direction and therefore he's on the backside of a play and his job isn't necessarily as urgent? And these are the kinds of questions that we have to answer all the time in all kinds of different player interactions. And one of the reasons why, as you guys talked about, it's a really difficult thing to do to analyze players in this sport. But I thought that particular case was a really salient way of representing that the directionality of these different effects isn't always obvious.
Yeah, right. Like it is obvious that it's hard to separate out quarterback performance from offensive coaching performance. Like I'm always talking about, where does Sean Payton end and Drew Brees begin? We'll hopefully get a little bit of a better answer of that this year, but even so, that'll still be anecdotal answers. It's not like we'll have an answer to the question. Here's a situation though, where you're talking about the quarterback orientation, where we actually can have all of the statistics that we want, and it's completely observable what the quarterback is doing, what the receivers are doing, et cetera. And still it's chicken and egg. And still it's like, where does one start and the other one begin? So really football, just the ultimate sport in terms of just like the interdependencies like this.
Yeah. The nice thing about having the tracking data is that you can use some aspects of like the timing of things and say, if the quarterback initially looked to his left and then moved towards his right, these are the sorts of things that are easier to do with the tracking data than having to chart each of these things independently. So having the stuff that's sort of time series data will allow you to get at least a sense for some of the directionality there, but you're not going to get a perfect answer.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of one of the things that I kind of found interesting, which was the whole conversation around understanding penalties, understanding officiating.
where that's going to go. I think I mentioned in the interview when we were talking that basketball has come such a long way. It's at a point where I can't watch college basketball officiating anymore because it's a totally different thing from NBA officiating. They've gotten so much better. I would love to see the NFL get to that point where they're doing things so well that it's really incumbent on other sports or other levels to catch up. One of the things that he mentioned in that was starting to quantify when holding penalties occur, and that being a really relevant data point for them. And that ties back to what you were just saying about, man, when we can tie together the next gen data points, the XY coordinates with the things like that, and not just the events that are happening, but the events that are happening when they're happening, I think there's really a lot that can be unlocked there over the next few years.
Yeah, and as it relates to the discussions about where to put the referees, like there's one aspect of where does the referee start, but then there's also elements of, well, you might want to start in one location, but plays consistently sort of move in certain directions in terms of where you should be looking and that sort of thing. So even the decisions about how a referee should look or move over the course of essentially progressions over the course of a play, that's the kind of stuff that you can use the tracking data for as well.
Right. I mean, just as simple as like NFL officials, you have guys that are responsible for looking at the interior offensive line for holding, the umpire, and then you have the line judges that are looking down at offense, at offsides, and everybody has their sort of responsibilities. I'm really curious as Michael gets further along and the whole next gen team with their analysis there at the NFL, if they start to find that maybe they should be reassigning actually what responsibilities different reps are. One thing that he said that was super obvious to me that I would love to see them change like right now is it doesn't have to be the official that's standing right next to the receiver that makes the pass interference call. Because maybe that's the official that's, like you mentioned, he's sprinting to get in position to make the call and he's obscured because he is so close. He actually has less of an angle to view the play. So that can go in so many different directions. It could be so much better. And then hopefully also at some point they figure out review and making that kind of finding its level.
Yeah, to me, that's a whole different, the review thing's kind of a whole different question. Yeah. The elements of this guy who's the closest isn't necessarily in the best position really lines up with the big data bowl type questions of on a running play, which players are in a best position to make tackles and all these sorts of same notions you can apply to referees and say, you could think about it as like the Madden cone from whatever 2006, where it's like, yeah, this person is closer, but is not necessarily doesn't have the right vision, isn't able to see it in the way that you want them to, and isn't on the right side of the play and that sort of thing. And so all these orientation and direction and speed elements that would also apply to on-field, football specific questions also applies to the referees.
Last question before we get out of here. Mike and I both reacted to kind of where will we be in 2030? And it's a whole lot of we don't even know what we don't know sort of stuff. But we can start to imagine things. I'm curious to hear the big broad question. What was your take on that?
I think the biggest thing, and we've seen this kind of in baseball as well, is the proliferation of advanced data sets to lower levels and to practice fields and all that kind of stuff. So, in baseball, we have all the high-speed cameras and tracking data, and that you can get some kid on a backfield using all that kind of stuff. And having access to those kinds of pieces of information for college, for high school, for whomever, I think that's really what's going to advance the conversation and allow people to get a longer time series of data for players and see how they develop over time. Because I think we have a hard time, especially in college. There are many different environments, and there's a small span of years, and then a big jump to the NFL. And having more consistent, sort of complete, fleshed out data sets over the course of a player's career, going back to even high school potentially, that's where you can really get some good answers on player development and that sort of thing.
Right. Like you only have a few years of college data. High school data is kind of the wild, wild west in terms of the usability of that. But if you do get to a certain point where you can have all that stuff, instead of just 32 teams playing 256, or I guess I should add 16 to that this year, whatever that number is, games per season, you're talking about 800, 900 college football games that happen every year and thousands of high school games that happen every year. So in terms of getting a broader sample, there's give and take there, right? We might not have the same consistency that we have in the competition of an NFL game, but we can sort of combat that with lots of data once we can sort of get there. All right. On that note, we will wrap up and get out of here. For Mark Simon, Alex Vigderman, and our guest, Michael Lopez, along with our producer, Justin Stein, as always, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for listening to the Off the Charts Football Podcast.